The Ozark Mountains in 1890 once stood as a place caught between two worlds. The old frontier spirit still lived in these hills, where men measured their worth by how well they could hunt, trap, and survive without needing much from the outside world. But change was coming. Railways were spreading across Arkansas. Towns were growing. The wilderness that once seemed endless was shrinking with each passing year. For some men, this made the untouched parts of the Ozarks even more precious. They wanted to taste that pure wilderness one more time before it disappeared forever. Devil's Den was one of those places that still felt truly wild. Located in what would later become a state park in northwestern Arkansas, it earned its name honestly. The area was a maze of sandstone bluffs, caves that seemed to tunnel deep into the earth itself, and rock formations that created natural shelters and hiding spots. Springs bubbled up from underground, creating clear pools surrounded by moss-covered stones. The trees grew thick here, their canopy blocking out the sun in places and creating pockets of permanent shadow even at midday. Local people had stories about the place. They said you could get lost in Devil's Den and never find your way out. They spoke of strange sounds that echoed through the hollows at night. Some claimed that Native American tribes had once used the caves for sacred ceremonies, and that the spirits of those rituals still lingered. Whether any of this was true didn't matter much. What mattered was that Devil's Den felt different. It felt separate from the normal world. In the spring of 1891, 12 men made plans to venture deep into this wilderness. They weren't inexperienced city dwellers looking for a simple camping trip. These were mountain men, or at least men who saw themselves that way. They knew how to read the land, how to follow game trails, how to build shelters from what the forest provided. Several had served as guides for wealthy hunters from the East Coast. Others made their living trapping animals for fur during the winter months. They were capable, confident, and eager to test themselves against the wilderness they claimed to understand so well. The expedition wasn't meant to be a casual weekend getaway. They planned to spend weeks deep in the most remote sections of Devil's Den, living entirely off the land. No supply runs back to civilization. No backup plans. They would hunt for their food, fish in the streams, and prove to themselves and anyone who would listen that they could survive the way their fathers and grandfathers had survived. There was pride involved, certainly, but there was also something else driving them. A sense that time was running out for this way of life, that soon these mountains would be tamed, mapped, and made safe for regular people. They wanted to experience the danger while it still existed. The group came together through word of mouth. One man would mention the idea at a trading post. Another would hear about it in a saloon in a small mountain town. They didn't all know each other well. Some were friends who had hunted together before. Others were acquaintances, connected only by their reputation as skilled woodsmen. A few were almost strangers, joining because they heard about the expedition and convinced the organizers they had the skills needed to pull their weight. This loose connection between the men would later make it difficult to piece together exactly what happened. No one kept detailed records of who was going or why. Families would later struggle to explain what drove their sons, husbands, or brothers to join an expedition that seemed risky even by the standards of the time. What we do know is that the 12 men gathered in early May, just as the weather was warming enough to make extended camping trips practical. They brought minimal supplies. Some carried rifles for hunting. Others brought fishing line, knives, and basic cooking equipment. They wore clothes made for hard use, already patched and worn from previous adventures. None of them seemed worried about what lay ahead. Several made jokes about how soft life had become in the towns, how people had forgotten what it meant to really live. They talked about returning with stories that would be told for years, about the game they would hunt, and the parts of Devil's Den that no white man had ever seen before. But beneath the confidence and the excitement, there were small cracks in the foundation of this adventure. Some of the men had personal problems they were running from. One was dealing with debts he couldn't pay. Another had a reputation for drinking too much and getting into fights. A third was known for his temper, his tendency to take offense at small slights and hold grudges that festered. These weren't necessarily dangerous flaws in normal life. But in the wilderness, where men would be pushed to their limits and forced to depend on each other completely, small personality conflicts could grow into something much worse. There were also practical concerns that some of the more experienced locals quietly mentioned. May in the Ozarks could bring unpredictable weather. Storms could blow in suddenly, making the already difficult terrain treacherous. The caves that made Devil's Den so distinctive could also become death traps if flash floods filled them with water. Wildlife in the area included black bears and venomous snakes. And then there was the simple fact that even experienced outdoorsmen could make mistakes. A twisted ankle miles from help could mean death. A wrong turn in the confusing landscape of bluffs and hollows could lead to days of wandering in circles. The wilderness didn't care about your experience or your confidence. It simply was what it was, indifferent to human suffering. But warnings from cautious townspeople weren't what these 12 men wanted to hear. They saw themselves as different, as capable of handling whatever the mountains threw at them. And so on a morning when the dew still clung to the grass and the sun was just starting to burn off the mist in the valleys, they headed into Devil's Den. They followed a trail that was barely more than a deer path, moving in a loose line through the trees. Some talked and laughed. Others were already quiet, focused on the experience of being away from civilization. They moved deeper into the wilderness, their voices gradually fading until the forest swallowed them completely and they were gone from the world they knew. Back in the small communities scattered around the edge of Devil's Den, life continued as normal. Families went about their daily work. Merchants opened their shops. Farmers tended their fields. A few people thought about the 12 men heading into the mountains, wondered idly how they were doing, then moved on to more immediate concerns. There was no reason to worry yet. The men had said they would be gone for weeks. It was only natural that no one would hear from them for a while. But as the days passed and then the weeks, and as spring gave way to early summer, something began to shift. The absence of the 12 men started to feel less like a planned adventure and more like something darker. And when 3 figures finally emerged from Devil's Den, exhausted and haunted, the truth began to reveal itself in fragments. Something had gone terribly wrong in those mountains. Something that would remain a mystery even as the survivors tried to explain what they had seen. The 3 men who came back arrived separately, each one stumbling out of the wilderness at different times over the course of a week. The first emerged near a settlement called Cane Hill, appearing at a farmer's door just after dawn. He was thin, his clothes torn, his face burned dark by the sun and scratched by branches. When the farmer asked where the others were, the man just shook his head and asked for water. He drank 3 full dippers before he could speak properly, and even then his words came out broken and confused. He said there had been an accident. Thought that things had gone wrong, that he didn't know where the others were anymore. The second survivor appeared 4 days later near the town of Winslow, walking along a road like a ghost. A woman hanging laundry saw him coming from a distance and thought at first he was sick with fever. He moved slowly, carefully, as if every step hurt. When her husband went out to help him, the man refused to talk about what had happened. He would only say that he needed to get home, that he wanted to leave Arkansas and never come back. The husband tried to press him for information about the expedition, about the other men, but the survivor became agitated and threatened to strike him if he didn't stop asking questions. The third man was found by a search party that had already started looking for the missing group. He was sitting beside a stream about 5 miles from the edge of Devil's Den, just sitting there staring at the water. He had a rifle across his lap, but no other supplies. When the searchers called out to him, he didn't respond at first. They had to physically shake him before he seemed to recognize they were there. This man was more willing to talk than the others, but what he said made little sense. He spoke about the camp, about arguments that turned violent, about men disappearing in the night. He said they had found something in one of the caves, something that changed everything, though he couldn't or wouldn't explain what it was. Within 2 weeks, enough pieces of the story began to emerge that the authorities in the area realized they were dealing with something serious. The local sheriff organized a proper expedition into Devil's Den to search for the 9 missing men. 20 volunteers joined, including some experienced trackers and hunters who knew the area well. They brought enough supplies for a week and set out following the route the original group was believed to have taken. What they found would raise more questions than it answered. The survivors had mentioned a main camp, and the search party located it after 3 days of careful tracking. It was situated in a protected hollow surrounded by high bluffs near a spring that provided fresh water. The location was actually well chosen, defensible, and with good access to game trails. But the condition of the camp told a story of chaos. Supplies were scattered everywhere. A tent had been erected, but then apparently torn down violently, the canvas ripped and the poles broken. There were signs of multiple fire pits, which was strange because a single fire would have been sufficient and safer. The ground around the camp was torn up, disturbed in ways that suggested struggle or frantic activity. Most disturbing were the personal items left behind. Boots sat beside one fire pit, still laced up as if someone had simply stepped out of them. A rifle leaned against a tree, loaded and ready to fire, but abandoned. Someone had carved words into a flat rock near the spring, but the message was incomplete and made no sense. It read, "Not what we thought," and then nothing else. The search party found several journals and notebooks which they hoped would explain what happened. But most had been burned, reduced to ashes and charred fragments of paper. Only one partial journal survived, and its entries became increasingly strange and paranoid as the dates progressed. The journal belonged to a man named William Prout, one of the more experienced members of the group. His early entries were ordinary, describing the journey into Devil's Den, the wildlife they saw, and the quality of the hunting. But within a week, the tone shifted. He wrote about disagreements over leadership. Several men had assumed they would make decisions collectively, but two individuals in particular kept trying to take control. One was a man named James Covington, who had organized much of the expedition. The other was Samuel Black, younger, but with a reputation as an exceptional tracker and survivalist. According to Prout's journal, these two men clashed almost immediately once they were deep in the wilderness. The conflict started over small things: which direction to move the camp, how to distribute the game they hunted, whether to explore a particular cave system or focus on establishing a secure base camp. But Prout noted that these surface disagreements seemed to mask something deeper. Covington and Black didn't just disagree on practical matters. They seemed to genuinely dislike each other. Covington came from a relatively prosperous family and had experience leading hunting parties for wealthy clients. He was used to being in charge, used to having his decisions followed. Black, on the other hand, had grown up poor in the mountains and had earned his reputation through hard work and skill rather than connections. He resented Covington's assumption of authority and made no secret of it. As the days passed, the rest of the group began to split into factions. Some sided with Covington, appreciating his organizational skills and experience with extended expeditions. Others gravitated toward Black, impressed by his knowledge of the wilderness and his ability to find game when others came back empty-handed. A few men, including Prout, tried to stay neutral, but this became increasingly difficult as the tension between the two leaders escalated. Prout wrote that meals became uncomfortable affairs, with long silences punctuated by passive-aggressive comments. Men stopped sleeping near each other, spreading out around the camp in small clusters based on their loyalties. The situation grew worse when the hunting became more difficult. The group had expected the wilderness to provide abundant game, but they had chosen a time of year when many animals were dispersed and harder to track. Several days passed, and the hunters came back with little or nothing. Rationing became necessary. Tempers grew shorter as hunger made everyone irritable. Black blamed Covington for choosing a poor location for the camp, arguing that they should move to where the game was more plentiful. Covington refused, saying that moving constantly would exhaust them and make them more vulnerable. The argument turned into a shouting match that nearly became physical before others intervened. Prout's journal also mentioned something that seemed insignificant at first but grew in importance. Several men reported hearing strange sounds at night, whistles that didn't sound like any bird they recognized, movement in the darkness beyond the firelight. Most attributed this to wildlife or the wind moving through the bluffs in strange ways, but a few became convinced they were being watched. One man, whose name Prout didn't record, became obsessed with the idea that someone else was in Devil's Den with them. He started taking long watches at night, sitting apart from the others with his rifle across his knees, staring into the darkness. When confronted about his behavior, he said he had seen figures moving through the trees, just at the edge of visibility. The cave exploration brought things to a crisis point. Black insisted they should investigate the cave systems in the area, arguing that the caves might provide shelter during storms and could contain animal dens where they could hunt. Covington thought it was too dangerous, that the caves were unpredictable and could trap them underground. But Black went anyway, taking 3 men who sided with him. They were gone for most of a day, and when they returned, something had changed. Black looked shaken, which was unusual for someone known for his composure. The men with him refused to talk about what they had seen in the caves, but they seemed disturbed. That night, according to Prout's journal, Black approached several members of the group and told them they needed to leave Devil's Den immediately. He said the place wasn't safe, that they had made a mistake coming here. When pressed for details, he became evasive, talking about things in the caves that didn't make sense, about spaces that seemed to shift and change. The others thought he was suffering from exhaustion or the stress of the expedition. Covington used Black's apparent breakdown as an opportunity to reassert his leadership, suggesting that Black was mentally unstable, and should be relieved of any decision-making authority. This was the breaking point. Black and Covington confronted each other directly with the rest of the group watching. Words turned to shoving. Shoving turned to actual fighting. The two men rolled on the ground, throwing punches and trying to gain an advantage. It took 4 men to pull them apart, and even then, both kept trying to get at each other. Prout wrote that he had never seen such rage between two people. It wasn't just anger over the disagreements. It was something primal, a hatred that seemed to have been building beneath the surface and finally erupted. The group split that night. Black and about 5 men who supported him took their share of the supplies and left, saying they would establish their own camp elsewhere in Devil's Den. Covington and his supporters stayed at the original location. Prout and 2 others tried to convince both groups to reconsider, to stick together for safety, but neither leader would bend. The division was complete. 2 camps now existed in the wilderness where there had been one, and the men who had come in as a unified group were now fractured and hostile to each other. Prout's journal entries became more sporadic after this. He mentioned that supplies were running even lower now that the group was divided. That game remained scarce. The weather had turned, with heavy rain making everything damp and miserable. His handwriting became shakier, suggesting exhaustion or illness. One entry simply read, "Something is very wrong here," with no further explanation. Another described waking in the night to find one of the men missing, only to have him return at dawn with no memory of leaving the camp. The final entries in Prout's journal were the most disturbing. He wrote about paranoia spreading through Covington's camp. Men accused each other of stealing food. Someone sabotaged a fish trap, though no one would admit to it. Covington himself seemed to be unraveling, talking about how the wilderness was testing them, how only the strongest would survive. He started talking about Black's group as enemies rather than fellow expedition members. There was a discussion of sending someone to spy on the other camp, to see what they were doing and whether they posed a threat. Prout's last entry was dated 3 weeks into the expedition. It said, "Going to find Black, try to reason with him. This has to end before someone dies." After that, the journal was blank. The searchers who found it could only speculate about what happened to Prout. His body was never found, nor were the bodies of most of the other missing men. The search party scoured the area for days, checking caves and hollows, looking for any sign of the 9 men who hadn't returned. They found a few more traces, a boot here, a torn piece of clothing there, but no bodies, no clear evidence of what had ultimately happened. They did find Black's secondary camp, about 2 miles from the original location. It was in even worse condition. The fire pit was massive, filled with ash and charred wood as if they had been burning everything they could find. Scattered around it were bones, some clearly from animals, but others of ambiguous origin that made the searchers uncomfortable. Strange symbols had been scratched into the bark of surrounding trees. Whether these had meaning or were just the random marks of disturbed minds, no one could say. The camp felt wrong in a way that was hard to articulate. Several members of the search party refused to spend the night there, insisting they make camp somewhere else, even though darkness was falling. The 3 survivors were questioned extensively, but their stories conflicted. The first man, the one who appeared at Cane Hill, claimed he had left the expedition early because he was sick. He said the group was intact when he departed, that there were arguments but nothing violent. The second survivor told a different story. He said the split between Covington and Black had led to actual combat, that men had died in fights between the 2 camps. But he couldn't or wouldn't say which men or how many. The third survivor, the one found sitting by the stream, gave the most detailed account. He spoke of madness descending on the camps, of men turning on each other over imagined slights, of paranoia and violence spiraling out of control. He said he had fled into the wilderness alone when it became clear that staying meant death. But even this account left massive gaps. Where were the bodies? If 9 men had died in Devil's Den, there should have been remains. The wilderness could claim bodies quickly through scavengers and decomposition, but not so thoroughly that a professional search party would find nothing. Some began to suspect that the survivors knew more than they were saying, that perhaps they were involved in whatever violence had occurred. Others wondered if the missing men had somehow survived and were still in the mountains, unable or unwilling to leave. A few whispered darker possibilities, that something in Devil's Den itself had claimed the men, some danger that the survivors couldn't or wouldn't name. The truth about what happened in Devil's Den emerged slowly, painfully, over months of investigation and reluctant testimony. The third survivor, the man found sitting by the stream, eventually broke under the weight of what he had witnessed. His name was Thomas Garrett, and in a series of interviews with local authorities and a journalist from Little Rock, he finally revealed the events that had led to the deaths of his companions. What he described was a descent into violence so complete that it seemed almost impossible to believe. Yet the physical evidence, what little there was, supported his account. It started on the 19th day of the expedition. By this point, both camps were in desperate condition. Food was nearly gone. The rain had continued for days, making it impossible to hunt effectively or keep anything dry. Men were sick with fever and dysentery. The division between Covington's group and Black's group had hardened into genuine hatred. They avoided each other completely, treating the other camp as hostile territory. But the crisis forced a confrontation. Covington's group had managed to bring down a deer, the first significant game in over a week. Black's men saw the smoke from their cooking fire and came to investigate. Garrett said that Black arrived with 4 men, all of them armed. They looked terrible, gaunt, and wild-eyed. Black demanded that Covington share the deer, arguing that they were all still part of the same expedition, that they needed to work together to survive. Covington refused. He said that Black had chosen to leave, had taken his share of supplies, and had no claim on anything Covington's group managed to acquire. The argument escalated quickly. Black pointed out that his men were starving, that Covington was condemning them to death by refusing to share. Covington responded that this was survival of the fittest, that Black had made his choices, and now had to live with the consequences. What happened next was chaotic and fast. One of Black's men, desperate and angry, rushed forward and tried to grab meat from where it was cooking over the fire. One of Covington's supporters knocked him down. Then everyone was moving, shouting, and weapons were being raised. Garrett said he remembered James Covington screaming for everyone to stop, but his voice was lost in the noise. A shot rang out. Nobody knew who fired first or whether it was intentional or accidental. But the sound of that gunshot changed everything. A man fell. Garrett couldn't remember his name, but he had been one of Black's supporters, a young man barely into his 20s. The bullet had caught him in the chest, and he went down hard, blood spreading across his shirt. For a moment, everyone froze. They stared at the wounded man, at the blood, at what had just become real. Then Black roared something incoherent and fired his own rifle. The bullet hit a tree inches from Covington's head. After that, there was no going back. The two groups scattered into the forest, using trees and rocks for cover. More shots were fired, the sound echoing off the bluffs and making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. Garrett dove behind a fallen log, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. He could hear men shouting, cursing, and some crying out in pain. Through the chaos, he saw Samuel Black running toward Covington's position, moving from tree to tree with his rifle ready. Covington was trying to reload, his hands shaking so badly he kept dropping cartridges. Black reached him before he could finish. What followed was brutal. Black hit Covington with the butt of his rifle, knocking him to the ground. Then he was on top of him, hitting him again and again. Garrett said he could hear the sounds of the blows even over the other noise, a wet, terrible rhythm. Other men were fighting hand to hand now, wrestling in the mud, using knives when guns were empty or too slow. The young man who had been shot first was still alive, making sounds that Garrett would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. Nobody went to help him. Everyone was too caught up in their own survival. Garrett didn't know how long the violence lasted. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. He stayed behind his log, too terrified to move, watching men he had shared meals with trying to kill each other. At some point, the shooting stopped. The sounds of fighting faded. An awful silence fell over the forest, broken only by heavy breathing and moaning from the wounded. Garrett slowly raised his head and looked around. Bodies were scattered across the clearing. Some were moving, trying to crawl to safety. Others were completely still. Samuel Black was standing over James Covington's body. His hands were covered in blood. His rifle lay on the ground beside him. He was breathing hard, staring down at what he had done with an expression that Garrett described as shock mixed with something else, something darker. Victory, maybe, or satisfaction, or just the numb realization that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. Other men were emerging from the trees now, checking on the fallen, trying to understand what had just happened. Garrett counted 7 men still standing, including himself. The rest were down. Some were clearly dead. Others were wounded badly enough that survival seemed unlikely without the medical help they didn't have. The young man who had been shot first had stopped making sounds. A man named Patterson had a knife wound in his side and was pressing his hands against it, blood seeping between his fingers. Another man was sitting against a tree holding his arm, which hung at an unnatural angle. The scene looked like a battlefield, which in a way it was. A small, stupid, pointless battle fought over a deer and pride and conflicts that should never have escalated this far. Black seemed to come back to himself. He looked around at the carnage, at the faces of the survivors, at the blood on his own hands. Garrett said that Black's expression changed to horror, as if he was only now understanding what he had done. He started to speak, to try to explain or justify, but the words wouldn't come. One of the men still loyal to him, a trapper named Hughes, walked over and put a hand on Black's shoulder. Hughes was crying, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his face. He said they needed to help the wounded, needed to do something other than stand there. But it was too late for most of them. Patterson died within an hour, his life bleeding out through the wound in his side while the others tried uselessly to stop it. The man with the broken arm went into shock and stopped responding to questions. By morning, he was dead too. The wounded from both sides received the same basic care the survivors could provide, which wasn't much. Strips of torn clothing for bandages, water from the spring, a fire to keep them warm, but infection and blood loss did their work. Within 3 days of the fight, only 5 men were still alive. Those 5 days after the violence were almost worse than the violence itself, according to Garrett. The survivors were trapped together by necessity, needing each other to have any hope of escaping Devil's Den, but unable to look each other in the eye. Samuel Black barely spoke. He sat apart from the others, staring at nothing. The weight of what had happened seemed to be crushing him. Hughes tried to organize them, to make plans for getting out of the wilderness, but his voice was hollow, and nobody had the energy to follow directions. They were all in shock, moving through the hours in a daze. They buried the dead in shallow graves, using sticks and flat rocks to dig, because they had lost most of their tools in the chaos. Garrett said the ground was hard and rocky, that it took hours to make holes deep enough. They didn't mark the graves because they had nothing to mark them with, and because part of them wanted to forget this place existed. They said no prayers because nobody could think of appropriate words. They just covered the bodies, piled rocks on top to keep animals from digging them up, and walked away. It was during this grim work that 2 more men disappeared. Garrett went to gather firewood, and when he returned, Black and another man named Frost were gone. Just gone, with no warning or explanation. Hughes found a brief note scratched into the dirt near where Black had been sitting. It said only, "Can't live with this." The 3 remaining men searched for hours, calling out names, checking the caves and hollows nearby. But Black and Frost had vanished into Devil's Den, as completely as if the earth had swallowed them. This left Garrett, Hughes, and one other man whose name Garrett never revealed. These 3 decided to leave separately. They didn't discuss it explicitly, but there was an unspoken understanding that staying together meant carrying the memory of what had happened, meant looking at faces that reminded them of the violence. Hughes said he would head north, try to find a way out through the bluffs. The unnamed man said he would go west, following a stream. Garrett chose to go east, back toward where they had originally entered Devil's Den. They divided what little supplies remained. They shook hands, though the gesture felt meaningless. Then they walked away from each other into the forest. Garrett said that his journey out of Devil's Den took 5 days, though he lost track of time, and it might have been longer. He wandered through the wilderness like a ghost, barely eating, sleeping only when exhaustion forced him to stop. He kept seeing the faces of the dead men, kept hearing the sounds of that terrible fight. He would wake from brief sleep convinced that he was still in the clearing, that the violence was still happening. Several times he considered just sitting down and waiting to die, letting the forest claim him like it had claimed the others. But something kept him moving forward. Not hope exactly. More like an animal instinct for survival that operates independently of his conscious mind. When he finally stumbled out of the wilderness and the search party found him sitting by that stream, he was barely human anymore. The trauma of what he had witnessed had hollowed him out. It took days before he could speak coherently. Weeks before he could tell the full story, and even then there were parts he couldn't articulate. The feeling of watching men he knew transform into killers. The sound of Covington's skull breaking under Black's rifle. The way the forest had seemed to close in around them afterward, as if Devil's Den itself was judging them for what they had done. The authorities tried to verify Garrett's account by locating the graves he described. A large expedition returned to Devil's Den with Garrett guiding them, but he couldn't find the exact location. The wilderness all looked the same to him now. The landmarks he remembered had either changed or had never been as distinctive as he thought. They searched for weeks, checking dozens of possible sites. They found the remains of the camps. They found scattered evidence of violence, bullet holes in trees, and blood stains on rocks. But they never found the graves. Devil's Den kept that secret. Those 9 men lost somewhere in its caves and hollows, their final resting place known only to the forest itself. The aftermath of the Devil's Den tragedy rippled outward through the small communities of northwestern Arkansas like a stone thrown into still water. The initial shock gave way to a complicated mixture of grief, anger, and confusion as families tried to make sense of what had happened to their sons, husbands, and brothers. 9 men had gone into the wilderness and never returned. 3 had come back broken and haunted. The simple fact of loss was hard enough, but the circumstances made it unbearable. Thomas Garrett's testimony created an impossible situation for the families of the dead. On one hand, they finally had answers about what had happened. Their loved ones hadn't simply gotten lost or fallen victim to some natural disaster. On the other hand, those answers were almost worse than not knowing. The men had killed each other. They had turned on one another over resources and pride, due to the gradual erosion of civilization that the wilderness had exposed. For families who had taken pride in their men's frontier skills and toughness, this revelation was devastating. It suggested that their loved ones weren't the capable survivors they had believed them to be, but rather men who had fallen apart when truly tested. James Covington's family struggled particularly hard with the truth. Covington had been well respected in his community, known as a skilled outdoorsman and guide. His wife, Margaret, had 3 young children to care for and no clear means of support now that her husband was gone. But beyond the practical difficulties, she faced whispers and speculation. Some people said that Covington had been arrogant, that his need to be in charge had helped create the division that led to violence. Others defended him, arguing that Samuel Black had been the aggressor, the one who had ultimately beaten Covington to death. Margaret found herself defending her dead husband's character to neighbors and even family members, trying to preserve some dignity for her children who would grow up without a father. Samuel Black's disappearance created a different kind of pain for his family. His mother, a widow who lived alone in a cabin in the hills, waited for months, hoping he would return. She refused to believe that her son was dead, clinging to the possibility that he had survived somehow and was living somewhere in the wilderness. When Garrett's account became public and people learned that Black had been the one to kill Covington, the old woman became a pariah. People who had once respected her son now crossed the street to avoid speaking with her. Someone painted the word murderer on her cabin door. She eventually moved away, leaving the area entirely to escape the judgment and hatred directed at her because of what her son had done. The unnamed 3rd survivor, whose identity Garrett had protected, was eventually identified through the process of elimination. His name was David Marsh, and he had made it back to his home in Missouri before anyone connected him to the Devil's Den expedition. When authorities finally tracked him down for questioning, they found him living in a state of severe mental decline. Marsh had told his family he had been on a simple hunting trip that had gone poorly. He hadn't mentioned the violence or the deaths. He spent his days sitting on his porch, staring toward the south where the Ozarks lay. His wife said he barely spoke anymore, that he would wake screaming from nightmares several times a week. He refused all attempts to get him to talk about what had happened in Devil's Den, and within 2 years of returning, he had drunk himself to death. Hughes, the 2nd survivor who had tried to organize the remaining men after the violence, made it out of the wilderness and returned to his home near Fayetteville. Unlike Garrett and Marsh, Hughes was more open about what had occurred, though his version of events differed in key details. He claimed that the violence had been unavoidable, that Black's group had been planning to attack regardless of what Covington did. He portrayed the fight as self-defense rather than a tragic escalation of conflict. Some believed him. Others thought he was trying to absolve himself of guilt by reframing the narrative. Hughes became something of a local figure, occasionally sought out by journalists or curious townspeople who wanted to hear about Devil's Den firsthand. But the attention took a toll. He developed a drinking problem similar to Marsh, and was known to become angry and violent when pressed too hard about the details of what had happened. The legal consequences of the Devil's Den deaths were complicated and ultimately unsatisfying. Arkansas authorities investigated whether criminal charges should be filed against any of the survivors. The problem was establishing exactly who had done what. Garrett claimed he had fired no shots and had hidden during most of the violence. Hughes said the same, though his account of being actively involved in organizing the survivors afterward raised questions about how passive he had actually been. Without bodies, without witnesses beyond the survivors themselves, and with the violence having occurred in an incredibly remote location, prosecutors found it nearly impossible to build a case. There was also the question of jurisdiction and whether the normal rules of law even applied. Devil's Den in 1891 was barely governed territory. Some legal scholars argued that what happened there fell into a gray area, that men who ventured into true wilderness essentially left civilized society and its protections behind. This argument was deeply controversial. Families of the dead wanted someone held accountable, but ultimately no charges were ever filed. The survivors were free to go on with their lives, carrying the weight of what they had experienced but facing no official punishment. The tragedy changed how people in the area viewed the wilderness. Before Devil's Den, there had been a romantic notion about testing oneself against nature, about proving manhood through survival skills and toughness. After Devil's Den, that romanticism was tainted. People began to understand that removing the structures of civilization didn't reveal some noble savage within. It simply removed the restraints that kept people's worst impulses in check. The wilderness wasn't a place to find yourself. It was a place where you could lose yourself entirely, where the thin veneer of social behavior could crack and reveal something brutal underneath. Churches in the area held memorial services for the dead, though without bodies, these felt incomplete and strange. Reverends struggled with what to say. Were the men who had died in the violence victims or perpetrators? Were they to be mourned or condemned? Most settled on acknowledging the tragedy while avoiding detailed discussion of what had occurred. They spoke in general terms about the dangers of pride and anger, about the importance of community and cooperation. But everyone in the congregations knew what had really happened, and the sermons felt hollow because of what they left unsaid. Thomas Garrett, the survivor who had finally told the full story, found his life transformed in ways he hadn't anticipated. Some people treated him as a hero for having the courage to reveal the truth. Others saw him as a traitor who had exposed shameful details that should have remained hidden. He received threatening letters from relatives of the dead who blamed him for tarnishing their loved ones' memories. He also received letters of gratitude from other relatives who said that knowing the truth, however painful, was better than uncertainty. Garrett tried to return to his normal life, working as a carpenter in a town east of the Ozarks. But people recognized him. They would stop him on the street to ask questions or share their opinions about what had happened. The attention became suffocating. Eventually, Garrett moved to Texas, far from Arkansas and the memories associated with it. He married, had children, and rarely spoke about Devil's Den again. But those who knew him said he was never quite right. He avoided forests and open wilderness. He wouldn't go hunting or camping. On quiet evenings, his wife would find him sitting alone, staring at nothing with an expression of deep sadness. He had survived the wilderness, but part of him had been left behind in those mountains, buried with the men whose graves he couldn't find again. The families of the men who had disappeared with Samuel Black, particularly Frost, who had vanished in the days after the violence, held out hope for years that their loved ones might still be alive. Occasional reports would surface of men matching their descriptions being seen in remote areas, living as hermits or wanderers. These sightings were never confirmed. Most likely, they were wishful thinking or cases of mistaken identity. But the lack of bodies meant families could never fully accept death. They existed in a painful limbo, unable to grieve properly because some small voice in the back of their minds kept whispering that maybe, somehow, their men were still out there. Devil's Den itself took on a darker reputation after 1891. People who had once viewed it as a challenging but rewarding wilderness now saw it as cursed or dangerous in ways that went beyond normal natural hazards. Stories spread about strange occurrences in the area, sounds and sights that couldn't be explained. Some of this was likely imagination and superstition feeding on the tragedy. But the stories persisted and grew. Hunters avoided certain sections entirely. Those who did venture deep into Devil's Den reported feeling watched, feeling an oppressive atmosphere that made them want to leave. Whether this was psychological, a response to knowing what had happened there, or something else, the effect was real. Devil's Den became a place associated with death and violence, and that association never fully went away. The expedition of 1891 served as a cautionary tale for subsequent generations. It was taught as an example of what could go wrong when men allowed pride and conflict to override common sense and cooperation. But the lesson went deeper than simple warnings about wilderness survival. It touched on fundamental questions about human nature, about what happens when the structures and expectations of society are removed. The 12 men who entered Devil's Den weren't criminals or sociopaths. They were normal people, respected in their communities, with families and friends who loved them. Yet under the right circumstances, or perhaps the wrong ones, they had turned on each other with lethal violence. This was the truly disturbing legacy of what happened. It suggested that the capacity for such violence existed in everyone, waiting for the right trigger to release it. The Devil's Den tragedy of 1891 faded from public attention within a few years, as tragedies often do. Newspapers moved on to other stories. The families of the dead rebuilt their lives as best they could. The survivors who remained in Arkansas eventually became just another part of the community, their connection to the events in the wilderness known but rarely discussed. Yet the questions raised by what happened in those mountains never fully disappeared. They lingered like shadows, asking uncomfortable things about the nature of civilization and the fragility of the social contracts that bind people together. Justice in any conventional sense was never served. No one stood trial for the deaths that occurred in Devil's Den. The survivors who could be identified and questioned maintained that the violence had been chaotic and mutual, that determining individual guilt was impossible. They weren't entirely wrong. When multiple armed men engage in close quarters combat in a state of panic and starvation, assigning blame becomes a philosophical exercise rather than a legal one. The prosecutor who initially investigated the case eventually concluded that pursuing charges would be futile. Without bodies that could be examined for evidence, without neutral witnesses, without any clear chain of events that could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, a trial would likely result in an acquittal. So the case remained officially unsolved, the deaths unexplained in legal terms, even though everyone knew generally what had occurred. This lack of legal resolution troubled many people at the time and continues to trouble those who study the case today. The families of James Covington felt that Samuel Black had murdered their loved one and escaped justice by disappearing into the wilderness. Black's family, conversely, believed their son had been defending himself and his men against aggression from Covington's group. Both sides had some validity to their claims, which was part of what made the situation so difficult. The violence in Devil's Den wasn't a simple story of good versus evil. It was a story of human beings under extreme stress making increasingly poor decisions until a point was reached where violence became inevitable. The broader impact of the Devil's Den tragedy was subtle but significant. In the years following 1891, attitudes toward wilderness expeditions changed across the Ozarks and similar frontier regions. Organizations that had previously operated with minimal oversight began implementing basic safety protocols. Expeditions required registered plans, check-in schedules, and designated leaders with proven experience. This wasn't the result of any formal law or regulation. Rather, it emerged organically from communities that had seen what could happen when men ventured into remote areas without structure or accountability. The idea of wilderness as a place where men could escape the constraints of civilization and find their true selves lost much of its appeal. People began to understand that those constraints existed for a reason. The case also raised questions about leadership and group dynamics that extended beyond wilderness survival. What happened when strong personalities clashed and no clear authority existed to mediate disputes? Devil's Den demonstrated how quickly such situations could deteriorate. James Covington and Samuel Black were both capable men with legitimate claims to leadership. Neither was willing to subordinate himself to the other. The rest of the group, rather than insisting on a unified command structure, allowed the division to happen and even chose sides. This splintering of the group's cohesion was the true catalyst for the violence that followed. Hunger and exhaustion and the stress of the environment certainly played roles, but the fundamental problem was social rather than environmental. Scholars and writers who examined the case in subsequent decades often drew parallels to other historical incidents, where groups isolated from normal society descended into violence. The Donner Party expedition of 1846-47 was frequently mentioned, though the circumstances differed significantly. What these cases shared was a demonstration of how rapidly civilized behavior could break down when food became scarce, when external threats emerged, and when the social structures that normally governed interaction were absent or weakened. Devil's Den became a case study in group psychology, used in academic discussions about human nature and social organization. The moral dimensions of what happened in Devil's Den remain contested. Some view the survivors as cowards who abandoned their companions and then tried to minimize their own culpability. Others see them as traumatized victims who witnessed horrors they never anticipated and barely escaped with their lives. The truth probably contains elements of both perspectives. Thomas Garrett's decision to eventually reveal the full story could be interpreted as an act of courage, forcing people to confront an ugly reality rather than letting it remain hidden. It could also be seen as a betrayal of the survivors' implicit agreement to keep the details private. Hughes's attempts to justify the violence and frame it as necessary self-defense were either honest recollections from a different perspective or self-serving lies meant to protect his reputation. Samuel Black's fate remains one of the enduring mysteries of the case. Did he die somewhere in the wilderness, unable to live with what he had done? Did he escape to another part of the country and start a new life under a different name? Occasional rumors surfaced over the years claiming he had been spotted in Montana, California, and even Mexico. None were ever verified. His mother died still believing he was alive somewhere, still hoping he would return. In some ways, Black's disappearance was fitting. He had become a symbol of the wilderness itself, of the unknown and unknowable aspects of human behavior when pushed to extremes. His absence from the historical record meant he could be whatever people needed him to be: murderer, victim, survivor, cautionary tale. The 9 men who died in Devil's Den were buried twice, in a sense. First in those unmarked graves that were never found again, swallowed by the forest and lost to time. Second, in the collective memory of their communities, the uncomfortable details of their deaths were gradually smoothed over and simplified. Over time, they became the men who died in Devil's Den without the messy reality of how they died or why. This simplified version of their story was easier to live with, easier to memorialize. But it also meant that the real lessons of what happened were partially lost. Those lessons were about the importance of structure and leadership in high-stress situations, about the danger of allowing personal conflicts to fester unaddressed, about the reality that removing people from civilization doesn't reveal noble savagery, but simply removes the external pressures that keep destructive impulses in check. The men who entered Devil's Den in May of 1891 weren't monsters. They were normal people who found themselves in circumstances they couldn't handle, making decisions that seemed reasonable or necessary in the moment, but led to catastrophic outcomes. The wilderness itself bore no blame and deserved no dark reputation. Devil's Den was simply a place, neither cursed nor malevolent. The rocks and trees and caves were indifferent to human drama. What happened there was entirely the result of human choices, human conflicts, and human limitations. Yet people needed to assign blame to something external, something other than themselves. Making Devil's Den into a place of danger and darkness was psychologically easier than accepting that the real danger had come from within the group, that ordinary men could become killers when circumstances aligned in the wrong ways. In the final analysis, the Devil's Den tragedy stands as a reminder of how thin the line between civilization and chaos actually is. We like to think of ourselves as fundamentally different from our ancestors, as more evolved and controlled. We point to laws and institutions and social norms as evidence of progress. But Devil's Den suggests that these structures are more fragile than we'd like to believe. Remove them, add stress and scarcity and fear, and people can revert to violence with shocking speed. This isn't a comfortable truth. It challenges our self-conception as rational, moral beings. But it's a truth that history demonstrates repeatedly, in contexts ranging from wilderness expeditions to urban riots to war. The 3 survivors who made it out of Devil's Den carried this truth with them for the rest of their lives. They had seen what people were capable of, had perhaps participated in it themselves. That knowledge changed them fundamentally. Thomas Garrett's move to Texas and his avoidance of the wilderness. David Marsh's descent into alcoholism and early death. Hughes's need to constantly retell and justify what happened. These were all responses to trauma, to having witnessed the breakdown of the civilized veneer they had taken for granted. They couldn't unknow what they had learned about human nature, and that knowledge was a burden that grew heavier with time rather than lighter. The families left behind struggled with a different burden. They had to reconcile their memories of their loved ones with the reality of how those men had died. A father who had been respected and capable had starved to death in the wilderness because he couldn't cooperate with others. A son who had been proud and strong had beaten a man to death with his rifle. A husband who had been reliable and steady had descended into paranoia and violence. These contradictions were difficult to hold simultaneously. Most families choose to emphasize the positive memories and minimize the circumstances of death. This was human and understandable, but it also meant that the full truth of Devil's Den was gradually obscured, filed away in old newspaper archives and fading memories. Today, Devil's Den is a state park. Families camp there. Children play on the same bluffs where men once fought and died. Hikers walk trails that might pass near those unmarked graves unknowingly. The wilderness that seemed so vast and dangerous in 1891 is now mapped and managed, with rangers and maintained trails and emergency services. The risk of getting lost or dying there is minimal with even basic preparation. Yet occasionally, someone studying the park's history will come across references to the tragedy of 1891. They'll read about the 12 men who entered and the 3 who returned. They'll wonder about the 9 who stayed. And they might look at the forest around them with new eyes, understanding that beneath the peaceful surface lies a history written in violence and loss. A reminder that wilderness, true wilderness, without structure or oversight or the moderating influence of society, reveals aspects of human nature that we prefer to keep hidden. The story of Devil's Den doesn't offer easy answers or clear moral lessons. It simply shows what happened when a group of capable, respected men ventured into isolation and encountered circumstances they couldn't manage. The fact that it happened once suggests it could happen again, given the right conditions. That possibility, more than any ghost story or local legend, is what makes Devil's Den truly haunting. Not because the land itself is cursed, but because it stands as evidence of what humans can become when the structures that define us as civilized are stripped away. That truth, uncomfortable and undeniable, is the real legacy of the 12 mountain men who entered the Ozarks in 1891 and the 9 who never came home.